Good afternoon or evening, depending on which side of the Atlantic you are. Welcome to this week's Global Christian Perspectives with me, Chris Eyre, and Elgin Hushbeck. Elgin, we've mentioned this. It's not on the running order, but some of our press are getting a little excited at the moment at Obama in an email basically suggesting that David Cameron may have taken his eye off the ball with Libya, in that really things went to rack and ruin after the fall of Gaddafi. Much as it pains me to say anything good about Cameron at all, I don't really think there was anything that he could sensibly have done in this particular case. What's your view on the subject?
Well, I would say to take your eye off the ball implies that there was some sort of coherent strategy that had been put forth, and that if it had been followed through, things would have been, shall we say, better. I mean, I don't think anyone expects perfect, but they would have been better. And then since supposedly Cameron took his eye off the ball, things went wrong. The problem I have with that is I was never really clear on what the strategy was on the first place, so it's not real clear to me how anyone could take their eye off the ball when no one knew what the ball really was. I think this is actually just, the other half of this is just, it's very typical Obama. He never takes any responsibility for anything that happens. We're coming to the end of his presidency, and he's still blaming the economy on the previous president, which, if that's a valid rationale, then that means Bush wasn't responsible for anything in his presidency. It was all Clinton's fault. Obviously, that doesn't hold true. So I think that's just par for the course. It's always somebody else's fault, and in this case, he's picking on Cameron.
Yeah, there is perhaps an argument that he'd expected Europe to pick up some slack on following that up, but in conscience, without boots on the ground in Libya, I have absolutely no idea what could have been done.
Yeah.
In point of fact, it might have been sensible for Europe to have done more, because the completely broken down Libya is now a prime jumping off point for illegal immigrants coming in via mainly Italy over the Mediterranean. So we do have a significant interest in it. Whether we could have predicted that back in 2011 is dubious. Most of us in 2011 were predicting that the Arab Spring was a marvelous thing, and generally speaking, it hasn't been.
Yeah, which actually corresponded to my predictions at the time. But I don't think you can actually say you could have predicted this. But I do think the general concern was, I think when it comes to interventions of that sort, you either have to go all in and go to the completion, or you stay out, because half measures are really oftentimes just make matters worse. And I think that's what we see here. Again, you can kind of go back to the models that I've mentioned before of Korea and Vietnam, and for at least for America. In Korea, we went in, we committed, and we stayed, and we're still there to this day. And as a result, South Korea has become effectively a first world nation, great standard of living. Vietnam, you could argue we somewhat did the same thing, except we pulled out, and you had the boat people and the re-education camps in Cambodia, and just so either that, I have to honestly admit, that has shaped my view of foreign policy, in the sense that it was part of my rationale for leaving some troops in Iraq in 2011, or 2010. I don't remember exactly which date that was that we pulled them out, but I argued, and the generals were arguing, that we should leave 10 to 30,000 troops there, and we pulled them out, and now we have ISIS. So again, I think you either, as painful as it is, and it is extremely painful and difficult, you either choose to stay out and just stand at the sidelines and watch the suffering, or you commit to go in, and if you're not ready to commit to go all the way in and do what's needed to end up with a, quote, South Korea, then you shouldn't go in at all.
And for a wonder, I agree with you. As soon as we did some bombing there, we sort of got ourselves a responsibility to follow through, and we couldn't and wouldn't. I mean, there was no way we were going to put British boots on the ground there, and I suspect the same went for the United States. Without that, maybe.
I don't know if it made any comment or splash over there, but that's where the famous line from Obama, "leading from behind," came out, specifically in terms of it was actually quoted by his advisors as their strategy. I don't think it was quite intended in the way that it's now come to be understood, but that was his policy. He wanted to lead from behind, which, in classic military terms, is something you do not do.
True enough. Anyhow, I don't particularly take it badly of Obama. I've got to admit, I'd swap him for Cameron any time.
I'll take that trade.
I thought you might. Moving on, we did have the Wednesday this week was International Women's Day, and I linked to a blog post indicating that there might be a certain amount of reluctance in some Christian circles still to accept any kind of equality of women. I know your feelings are more that we're 50 years on and we haven't got as far as we might have. What would you like to understand?
I think the women's movement, and in all honesty, I'm getting a lot of this from my wife. I think the women's movement it took a wrong turn, and it took a wrong turn back in the 60s, maybe earlier. I'm not that much of a knowledgeable person in the details of history, but I know from the 60s forward, it took this confusion of equality with sameness, and that's something I fundamentally reject. I think we are all created in the eyes of God, and we're all equal in the eyes of God. I don't believe we're all the same. I don't believe I've got just as much right to go out and play professional basketball as someone who's, say, slightly taller than I am. We're not the same. We have different abilities. And for me, the equality comes in terms of being able to express your abilities and seek to be whatever you want to be. Somehow that got transformed into the women's movement, that women need to be like men, and they need to act like men, and they need to do everything that a man can do. And you ended up with a famous quote from maybe Betty Friedan or one of the early feminists that, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. And that just, I think you ended up with a lot of women, I think, being pushed not because they wanted to go into the marketplace, but being told that this is where you need to be. And in fact, there was great pressure put on women that if you wanted to just have a husband, get married, and raise children, you were somehow betraying the sisterhood. And I know I met lots of women who chose that path and felt very very put upon and pressured by the feminist movement that they had freedom to choose, but they didn't make the right choice. And I think now we are 60 years later. I think, if you take 50% of the workforce and then suddenly, move them in and take on jobs, supply and demand says you're going to decrease the wage base, which is something we've definitely seen. Now, instead of one income being able to support a family, you need two incomes to support a family. And the freedom to get out there and explore your career has become the drudgery of being chained to a drudgery work, wondering why you can't be home with your children, why you have to pay for childcare and all this other stuff. So I don't think the women's movement has made quite the advances. I am all supportive for, equal rights. I mean, my wife has 2 master's degrees. She's hardly barefoot and pregnant and chained to the kitchen. In fact, I do most of the cooking. So, I want people to achieve what they want to achieve and not be forced to do things And I think this had some side effects that we could explore if you're interested in. But that's kind of my broad view.
How in terms of the church? As I see it, there is nothing in terms of pastoring a church that is a particularly male preserve. But of course, we do have bits in particularly the 2 Timothy passages that were mentioned in the article, where if it is Paul who wrote 2 Timothy, which I don't personally think it was,
I do.
I thought you might. He is completely turning around from some of the earlier letters where he's praising women as leading churches and hailing Junior as an apostle, for instance, to women should not be heard in church at all. Are you still of the view that that's the case?
I'm ambivalent on that. I don't have strong opinions either way, and part of my problem is the current culture. There are certain questions that you really cannot explore currently. We talk about freedom of speech and freedom of equality or inquiry in universities, but that's just not true. In fact, we're going strongly in the opposite direction with political correctness and stuff. I do think that very strongly that men and women are different. They are not the same. Also, I know that over the dynamics of say, schools over the last 50 years, the number of women principals has been on the increase. And there are certain things that happen in schools these days that I just have a hard time believing would have happened if a man had been the principal and in charge of things. Now, maybe that's culture. Maybe the whole thing has changed. I don't know. But I hear these reports such as, for example, when I grew up, we used to have a game called dodgeball, where you would have a soft rubber ball and you try to hit people with it, right? Well, that's very aggressive, and they've now banned that because we shouldn't be throwing balls at people. And you kind of guess which gender is behind that. So I do think there's a difference. Men tend to be, as a general rule, more rules-based. Women tend to be, as a general rule, more compassionate and understanding in terms of, that's why I think in terms of family structure, I think it needs a man and a woman, that they are different. Whether that applies up to the church, I don't know. And so I don't know whether there are certain passages in Paul that I think are very clearly cultural, that you don't rock the boat within the time. For example, if Paul was writing to a church in Saudi Arabia, he would probably tell women to cover their heads if it was modern day Saudi Arabia. Does that mean that a Christian woman must always cover her head? I would say not. But if you're going to live in Saudi Arabia, you probably don't want to rock the culture, and that's not the purpose of Christians, is to rock the culture. Where our purpose is to reach out and proclaim the gospel. And so if we're doing something that gets in the way of that, we shouldn't do that, whatever it is. Now, I don't know whether that was a cultural, those passages were cultural, or whether they were not. I could kind of make the case both ways, and I just don't know which way to go with that.
Okay, I mean, my view is that it's not Paul, it's a later commentator, but that it is distinctly cultural. I mean, if you want to look for approval, you can find approval of slavery in a way in Philemon, and obviously in the Pentateuch. We don't really think that we should follow those lines anymore. I did see an amusing piece with somebody asking, as an American, whether he could in fact take Canadian slaves, or whether they counted as effectively the same nation, so he couldn't take them in terms of Leviticus. I don't see anything that would invalidate a woman's position as a priest or pastor, and happily my own denomination has almost caught up with that, in that we actually expect that the Church of England is going to have some women bishops in the near future.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, and like I said, I'm a little bit more. To me, it's just not a big issue. I don't mind that women are pastors, or as I'm not Catholic, so it's not a pressing issue for me. I actually don't even know if my denomination allows women pastors, or like
okay.
I said.
Moving on, another anniversary this week, in fact yesterday over here, was the anniversary of the Dunblane School massacre in Scotland, which was the first of two mass shootings which progressively resulted in an almost complete ban on handguns over here. We were more restrictive than the States was before that, but we're now basically totally restrictive of privately owned handguns outside gun clubs. But it seems the attitude is totally different in the States, and I do keep seeing reports of mass killings on a rather regular basis, and your statistics for deaths by guns are appalling. Yes, the major use is in fact suicide, followed by homicide, followed by accident. But even the number of accidental deaths is one which I find hard to swallow. I did link also to a humorous piece from an Australian comedian talking about the difference between them and the States, and they did have one massacre, and basically the government turned around and said, enough, we are going to ban handguns. And the Australian reaction to that, as he points out, was, yeah, seems fair to us. The American reaction anytime anybody suggests that is very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
It seems obvious to me that you ought to be banning handguns and automatic weapons for private use. Why doesn't it happen?
Well, actually, it does in the sense of automatic weapons. Automatic weapons are illegal. They're still prevalent, but they are illegal everywhere in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you have a special gun collector's license, you're not allowed to hold an automatic weapon. Unless you're in the military, of course. The military has automatic weapons, but that's another issue. They have tanks, too.
Semi-automatic?
Semi-automatic you can have, yep.
Yes. Well, I'd include semi-automatic.
Okay. The vast difference here is that, well, particularly from the right, the left obviously supports a lot of gun control. But from the right, when we see that, we see it's an interesting fundamental dynamic that maybe we should explore sometime in depth. But when I see a big school or theater shooting or something like that, I focus on the problem with the person. What kind of person could do that? And the left tends to focus on the gun, the inanimate object, and saying we need to get rid of the gun. The worst school massacre in this country occurred back in the 1930s, and it was done by a bomb.
Mm-hmm.
Some guy filled up his truck with dynamite and blew up a school. So the propensity to commit evil is far more, I don't really want to use the word interesting, but to me, far more pertinent than the method by which the evil is committed. And so when I see people committing these, one of the big issues I have, I think it partly the American culture. I don't know if this happens in England, but this is how people get their 15 minutes of fame. And you can see this in the sense that these people write these big, long manifestos with the idea that they're going to make their statement and they're going to kill a bunch of innocent people. And that will get their statement heard. And the press follows along sometimes, although they're getting better at it. In the early days, they would go out and publish these things, and they would spend hours talking about this person and what would cause him to do that and what about his issues and things like that. Which to me, I don't even mention their names. When I write a blog post or something on them, that's the last thing I want to do. is give them any publicity. I'd rather talk about the victims and mourn for the victims that are gone. But the other aspect of this is when you talk about America, America is an extremely large country. And there are regions within America that are effectively different areas culturally. So, for example, I live in Wisconsin. It's a very, very gun-friendly state. We have, we have lots of people. Hunting is very big out here. Target shooting, bow and arrow shooting is very popular here. Very close to the wilderness in that sense, although there's no real wilderness around us. When I lived in Montana, there were times I carried a weapon on my side. I had a pistol. It would be loaded with snake shot when I was going out fishing, so that if a rattlesnake came up, I would be able to, use that, but never had to. But you would see people from time to time with sidearms. Not a big deal. You go into a big city, however, that's vastly different. In fact, most of the cities have very strong gun control. So there, people here in Wisconsin, they get kind of puzzled as to why should they have to give up their guns because there are gangland shootings and murders and because of some person who was mentally ill was unstable. That's a large part of the issue.
There is an extremely large ill. Are they not prepared to give up handguns, for instance, in the interests of the wider community so that handguns are not legally available?
Well, the other aspect of this is there are so many guns in this country, and quite frankly, the gun purchase rate has been skyrocketing over the last couple of decades. Actually, if you want to get gun control, the last thing you should do is talk about guns because it seems to spike gun sales. There are so many guns, it would be, quite frankly, for all practical purposes, it's impossible to get rid of all the guns. There's just too many of them in society. I have an antique flintlock hanging up over my fireplace. Is that going to be confiscated? It's certainly not functional. But
Australia managed it.
Australia is a much smaller country in the number of people. They're mostly confined on the East Coast.
They also have a lot of people in semi-wilderness areas. They have a lot of people who hunt and shoot in a similar way. But it doesn't restrict hunting and shooting. It's the handguns and the automatic and semi-automatic weapons, which really are inappropriate for hunting.
True, but the other aspect here is self-defense. I mean,
yes, there
are people who defend themselves with guns. We have concealed carry here, where you can have a concealed weapon. And, it does solve some crime. For example, I remember reading a report of an incident in Florida where a Vietnamese guy was being harassed by what you would effectively call a redneck. And the only thing he did is he lifted up his shirt and showed that he had a weapon because the guy was coming, threatening him with a knife. He lifted up his shirt, showed that there was a pistol there, lowered it, and the guy ran away. He reported it to police and the guy was arrested. That does happen. There are people who had their house broken into and they defend themselves with guns. They're not likely to want to give up their right to defend themselves. As the saying goes around here, when seconds matter, it's nice to know the police are only minutes away.
I've got to say that if I had a gun in my house, I would feel less safe than if I had no gun in the house at all, because I'd consider with considerable justifications from statistics that the chances of a fatal accident with the gun in my possession was far higher than any possibility of me defending myself against an armed attack. Um, it's something that would make me feel really unsafe, unless, of course, it happened to be in a locked gun safe, in which case, as Jim Jeffries comments, it's a fat lot of use for defending yourself in an emergency situation.
Yeah, I agree with that last part.
Um, I do not believe it as self-defense. I cannot see this. I've got to see it as something to do with an ethos, and I suppose that takes me on to my rather flippant comment some while ago when you were asking about the three founding principles of America, and I suggested money, violence, and fast food, and this is the violence one. I look at sort of comparative stuff from our media, and so often, if there's a more or less parallel situation, the solution in a US drama is solve the problem with violence, whereas the problem is solved over here by talking, by some non-violent or at least less violent solution. And I am all in favor of a less violent society. I think we're enjoined to be non-violent by Jesus.
Yeah, and I would say that's very true when possible. I think the other aspect of it, well, you talk about the I would agree with you. There's, in terms of the founding principles, there's a very much a risk in this country that the country will cease to exist as it was founded. I think we're actually at a turning point on that. You can see this in the moral decay, and I actually kind of find it ironic that the people. I mean, if you were to poll Hollywood is extremely liberal, and yet they put out movies that are extremely violent, almost antithetical to their principles. At least some of their principles. Other principles they weave in. So, I mean, one of the little interesting tidbits is, you're 5 times more likely to commit murder in a TV show, your character, if you're a CEO as opposed to a criminal. Because that's how they throughout our entire culture, they demonize capitalism, they demonize the CEO. The evil person is inevitably the upper management or something. Workers are always wonderful, and yet they put out also these movies that are extremely violent, extremely loaded with sex, gratuitous sex. I mean, the moral decline of America is very strong, and it's coming from the people that would decry a lot of those values to begin with. It's extremely interesting. Michael Medved did a study on the movies, and he showed that if you go look at the top 10 list, all the top 10 movies except for The Passion of the Christ are PG movies, PG-13. Often, many of them have very good value structures to them. They're not the ultra-violent movies that you sometimes, that you often see. So unless you're maybe talking about Star Wars or some sort of fantasy situation of good versus evil that way. But other than that, they're pretty good. And yet most of the movies that Hollywood makes are actually R-rated movies. So that don't make a lot of money. But it's a little bit of a quandary as to, you think they're there just to make the money. It's kind of strange why they make some of the movies they do, because they're not the money-making movies, and they're not the movies that totally represent their values. So why are they even making them?
An interesting question, and one to which I don't have an answer. We are sort of at the halfway point, so a brief interlude while perhaps you plug your books and say a bit more about who you are. I'm Chris Eyre. I'm an Energian editor, and I blog at airlines.energian.net.
I'm Elgin Hushbeck, as I already said, from Wausau, Wisconsin, in the United States. I've written 4 books, 2 on religion, 2 on politics, and I have a twice a month column on the Energian Discussion Network.
Excellent. I want to pick up there on your theme of feeling that there was a danger of your country falling apart in the future, because I also feel that my country is falling apart from the values that it used to have in my youth. But of course, I grew up in the 60s and 70s here, when my country was far, far more socialist than it is now. The Thatcher government, and with no particular help from the Blair government, and then the Cameron government, have moved very much towards, well, the ostensible ethos is free market, but there's a sizable amount, I think, in it of what you'd refer to as maybe crony capitalism. I am seeing normal people put into a desperate situation, and it's not just the traditional extreme lower classes who find the work situation perilous. In fact, when I left school and later left university, it was very, very easy for somebody, even with no qualifications here, to walk into really quite a well-paying job. And most people felt at the time that they had reasonable job security for life if they wanted it. My children now, with a move towards a more free market, less welfare state-oriented system, they have very little security. They're offered 0 hours contracts, which my daughter has recently got off onto something better, which are pernicious things. They don't expect to stay in a job very long because there's very little security in the job market. And we're talking about even people who've got degrees. I got a degree and it was paid for by the state, as was my minimal living expenses while I got one. My children have crippling levels of student debt to start them out on their lives. I am looking at a world with an increasing section of the population which is basically desperate. And I don't think that movement can carry on much longer without things falling apart. Now, that's obviously from an entirely different perspective from your thoughts about the states falling apart. How do you see that?
It's not completely separate. There's 2 main issues I see here. One, the American experiment, if you want to call it that, was to have limited government with, quite frankly and quite honestly, a religious population. That social control, you've got to have some means of social control. And the religious experiment was to try and minimize government's role, encourage religion, not one religion, but religion in general, which for them was primarily Jewish, Christian, with maybe a hint of Islam, because they had heard of Islam, but it really wasn't that much of an issue. So it's largely Judeo-Christian. And so the values and the social structure would be handled by the churches, and the government would just basically be there as a framework. The original idea, the Articles of Confederation, didn't work very well, though they did the Constitution, which gave a little more power to the federal government, but strongly limited and divided it up so there would be no centralization of power. It was basically what they were trying to avoid. That worked well up until the early part of the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson was our first president who really didn't like the Constitution and thought it was a hindrance. Was expanded under FDR, and now with Obama and the later Democrats, not just him, but basically since the 1960s, that's been pretty much revolutionized in the sense that where we once had a written constitution, for all intents and purposes, we no longer do. We still have a document, but the document is now under a doctrine called the living constitution. Basically means whatever a current majority on the Supreme Court thinks it might mean, which is why our Supreme Court appointments have gone from being boring ho-hum things that they do occasionally when someone dies to now with the death of Scalia, it's a huge political battle because the courts actually shape where the country is going now rather than the people. And that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is the idea that we are centralizing government. We are the federal government. And I believe, by the way, this is much bigger than what you get. I recently saw a report comparing the cost of getting a drug approved in the United States versus a cost of getting a drug approved in Europe. 65% of the cost of getting a drug approved in the United States is basically bureaucratic overhead, all the hurdles and things they have to do, the forms in triplicate, the numerous testing, that counts for 65% in the cost of a development of a drug. And when we're talking about the development of a drug, an average drug here costs around $500 million to develop and get to market. And very few of them actually make it. 1 out of 100 might make it to market. So, that's a significant amount of cost. In Europe, it's roughly about 20%. So you can get drugs to market cheaper because your bureaucratic overhead is much lower. Now, I don't happen to believe that you in Europe are being reckless and running drugs onto the market without any
no, neither do I.
But we're having to pay a lot more because the government basically says you have to fill out all these forms. So, and there's a huge industry that's centered around, servicing people. So to be able to actually navigate the mazes of government. So when we, I see our debt now is up to $19 trillion, well over the gross national product. It seems to have, it slows down occasionally from time to time, but it ramps up again. And in my book, I actually have a chart that says if it grew this century like it grew last century, we would be at 100% taxation by the end of the century. Obviously, that can't happen. At some point, the system will collapse under the burden. We have lots of people depending on Social Security. Social Security is going to go, depending on how you calculate the books, it's going to either go bankrupt within the next couple of years, or it'll go bankrupt in 2030, 2035. Either way, it's going bankrupt. Medicare is even in worse state. There was actually a study that compared medical outcomes based on people who are on Medicare, people who had insurance, and people who had no insurance. And it actually turned out you were best if you had regular insurance, but surprisingly, you were actually better off with no insurance than if you had Medicare because the system is so bad. So when you try, now add to that we're having the same labor problems here in the sense that people are graduating, they can't find jobs, there's no jobs out there. They're talking about the wonderful unemployment rate, but quite frankly, our employment rate here is because people have given up looking and left the job market. And since we only count those actively looking, it looks like we're down to 4.9% or whatever we are now. In reality, since Obama took office, except for I think 2 months, every single month, more people have given up than actually found jobs, and that's why the unemployment rate has come down. This can't go on forever, and Herb Stein famously said, "That which cannot go on forever won't." And so, at some point, we're gonna reach the breaking point. I don't know when that is. It could be soon. The turmoils we're seeing in the market could be the beginning of it. It could be 10 years off. But unless we change course, the metaphor I often use is we're speeding in the dark towards a cliff. And the question is should we go full blast or should we slow down a bit?
Okay.
No one seems to be arguing that we should turn around.
I heard people from your side of the Atlantic talking in similar glowing terms about the FDR days as I do about the 60s, 70s. And I will say I accept there was a lot wrong with the 60s and 70s. There was significant unrest, particularly during the 70s, with a conflict between government and unions, which eventually the unions comprehensively lost. That was not a good thing. You had the FDR days, which you don't seem to think was a good idea. I think I've got to point out that we came out of World War II with a national debt of about twice the GDP at the time.
Mm-hmm.
We elected a Labour government who promptly set out on a programme of creating a good bit of our welfare state, and at the same time with a huge programme of infrastructure creation, particularly creating a lot of social housing. Thus, obviously, a very high spending policy. And it seems to have worked very nicely for us. Obviously, we were in an economic hole after the Second World War. That may have acted as a stimulus. So I'm not quite sure how that one works out. If you have a bad economy, it seems to me if you have the power to do it, borrowing to spend yourself out of it is actually not such a terrible idea.
I think there's actually a point to that. The point isn't so much what we do. I mean, I have a lot of problems with what Roosevelt did, and quite frankly, with what Hoover did. I actually don't see a whole lot of difference between Hoover and Roosevelt in terms of their management of the economy, which is why neither of them was very successful about getting us out of the Depression. Mm-hmm. And but that's, we can have that discussion some other time. What my problem is that in the States, at least, we borrow with the quote, we need to get out of the hole, so we're going to borrow money. Okay, fine. Then when you're out of the hole, suddenly we need to borrow more money. I mean, and we never stop borrowing money. In the good times, we borrow more, and in the bad times, we justify it because we need to get out of the hole. If you go back to the Reagan years, Reagan is often criticized by Democrats for creating deficits, which quite frankly, the deficits existed before that as well. Since World War II, we only had 1 year where we didn't have a deficit. That was 1969, and that was a mistake. Mm-hmm. Actually, there was some around 2002, as well. But that was the internet bubble bringing in lots of cash. But other than that, we've been in deficits. The problem with Reagan came in a recession, and 8 years later had doubled the amount of revenue coming into the government. The problem is they more than doubled the spending. So, and I have an example in my book where California did exactly the same thing. I mean, there's just, that's the problem. It's not how, and I actually don't believe the problem is how much we tax. Government gets more than enough money to do everything it needs to do and do it quite nicely. The problem is they're always spending more, and their solution to every problem is create a new program, which is why we talked about mental illness a while back. And
Yes.
the fact that we have something like 20 to 30 different programs on mental illness, which are not doing a whole lot more than basically funding the bureaucrats who have the jobs who supposedly push the paper around. So that's where I think the problem comes in. Not so much. By the way, I believe in taking care of the poor. I believe that we need a safety net. I just believe that there's some better ways to let people get out of poverty and get into the workforce and become much better than what they are right now.
I basically interpret a very large number of the red letter statements of Jesus in the Gospels as indicating that as a community as a whole, we have a responsibility to manage at least the bottom two levels on Maslow's hierarchy. We need to provide adequate food, clothing, shelter, and hopefully security to at least a reasonable extent. Adequate is not luxurious. I think there's still an incentive financially to want more than that. But in any event, I look at the history of the development of technology, and the whole thrust of it is to minimize labor. Hopefully getting rid of labor altogether. Labor-saving devices are wonderful things unless the labor that's saved is your job.
Yep. You ever watch Downton Abbey?
No, I admit I haven't, but my women folk watch that on a regular basis.
It's got some interesting, dynamics in that sense, because it's essentially looking at the transition of, the early part of the 20th century where the great owners and landowners were basically being reduced down and essentially driven out of existence. And one of the things that happened there is the people who did all the housework lost their positions.
Yes.
If you're going to have, one of the things I see about automation is, if you're on a factory floor, automation can get rid of your job. If you're in an office, automation oftentimes frees up your time to actually do the things that you really should be doing and to manage it well. So automation can cost jobs. On the other hand, automation can create jobs. I'm employed because of automation, because someone has to write the software, someone has to manage it. That's just the way things are. And so as the economy changes, yes, as the classic example we tend to use here is the invention of the automobile eliminated the buggy whip industry. If you were doing that, then you needed to get into a new job. But still, we need to focus on. I think the problem we have in the States is we need to focus on job creation. Little interesting tidbit. There's every once in a while I see lots of these articles that when you rate the poor, the poor generally are measured as the lowest 60% in the economy. So they take the baseline of the economy at 60% and it's lower. One of the things that they don't account for here is they don't include federal benefits. So if you get welfare or you get housing allowance or you get that's not included when they count out how much money you have. So quite frankly, one of the big problems we have in this country with the poor is obesity. the poor are much more likely to be obese than the rich are. Most of the poor here, and quite frankly, I can send you some articles on this, but the poor actually in this country rate as middle class throughout most of Europe in terms of their purchasing power and the things they have. So the other thing I think is kind of insidious is we build into our systems that the poor actually get so much that there's a trough they have to go through to get out into the working force, because they get so much benefits. To actually take a paying job at minimum wage would cost them money.
Yeah.
And so we discourage people from getting off of work. That was actually one of the things about the Welfare Reform Act that was pushed by the Republicans so strongly in the late 90s, was to make mechanisms that allowed people to get out of poverty, get out of dependence, and get into the workforce. So there are things we can do, and I'm not opposed to doing that. I want to make sure that they're efficient and they allow people to progress.
Yes, our government has been cutting back benefits on much the same basis. That the problem is that a minimum wage job doesn't pay enough to be more attractive than benefits. The net result is that people who are on benefits are starving, or they're freezing to death, or there is no way they can afford accommodation apart from kipping on somebody else's couch. The problem is with both the minimum wage and the benefits, in my view, neither actually gives you enough to live on. And I do know something of what I speak, because I spent a short period of time actually trying to live on state benefits some years ago. And it is really impossible to have any reasonable standard of life unless you go out and cheat in some way, and I wasn't prepared to do that. I know a lot of people do. There's a black economy here. I really can't blame them.
Yeah.
My own feeling at the moment is that we are going to have to move eventually to a concept of a national or a citizen wage, which you get for being alive and being a citizen of the country, irrespective of whether you work. That should be enough to keep you in a minimal way. Anything beyond that can probably be taxed at a flat rate, although I'd still probably encourage there being higher rates on immense earners. I have thus simplified the benefit and tax systems remarkably, though I have to admit that's contributed towards the jobless totals, as we can sack a lot of civil servants.
By the way, that's one of the reasons when we talk about the income tax here, the lower 50% only pay 3.9% of the total income tax, and the lower 40% income tax is actually something they get, because we have what is called the earned income tax credit, which actually is a block amount of money. If you owe $100 in taxes, was all said and done, and you got a $500 income tax credit, then they will send you a check for $400. So that's actually a way of transferring monies. I support programs that, for example, if you're on welfare or some sort of state benefit, and if you go out and get a job, I would like to see your benefits reduced proportionally, so that there is always a benefit to getting a job. So if you're making X, that when you go to get a job and you get a job, you get, say, 50% of what your benefits were before. So that there's a big incentive to get a job. And then as you grow at each step of the wage force, as you move up, your benefits get proportionally reduced. It's always a benefit to go up and to work harder and advance yourself, but you don't get trapped into a particular situation.
I think my idea of the national wage does the job as well. What my idea also does is basically mean that employers can no longer absolutely hold the workforce to ransom for jobs at absolutely stupid wages, because nobody is going to be prepared, or almost nobody is going to be prepared to do a job at a really stupid wage. It's just not going to provide them enough to be worth going to work for. However, that amount might well be even less than today's minimum wage, because they are already being provided for with the basic necessities of life. And incidentally, I forgot to include healthcare. I do not personally see any alternative to universal healthcare free at the point of delivery, which is what our National Health Service was supposed to provide, and doesn't fall too far short of even now.
There are lots of other possibilities. You could, for example, you could set up a health savings account, which is one of the big things that the conservatives are pushing here, where, let's say you wanted the government to fund it, they would put money into the health savings account. You're free then to go out and purchase your insurance or save that money up. After 10 years, any money you don't use reverts back to you. That would provide insurance to people. It would introduce competition into the system. You know, there's numerous ways you can do this. I think Obamacare was probably the absolute worst way, but then again, different subject, but I don't think it was actually ever meant to be law.
It may well have been the absolute worst way that it could be provided at all. I mean, I am completely against the concept of competition in healthcare. The government here has been attempting to introduce competition into our healthcare system, and it is going downhill rapidly as a result. And one of the effects is that we train up junior doctors and they leave the country as soon as their period of enforced service is over, because the system is so nasty to them these days.
Well, competition can be done well or poorly.
Yes. Hey ho. Yeah, I think we've run out of time on this, and we've probably not run out of arguments.
We never seem to.
We never seem to. Well, we will presumably be resuming at the same time next Friday. So by all means, tune in then, and have a good week in the meantime from myself and Elgin.